Now, another function of government is to rein in private sector entities that grow on account of profiting from pain. Now, what does that mean to profit from pain? Sometimes an industry delivers a product or service that is designed to mitigate a negative event or a negative aspect of society, but then that industry, because of its innate need to grow, has a need for new and ever-growing demand. And sometimes it gets to a point of having to create new demand. Before World War II, the United States military was very small. I've seen various quotes saying that it was the 19th most powerful military in the world. And the United States' geographical location was extremely favorable compared to all the turmoil in the Eastern Hemisphere. The Eastern Hemisphere had World War I. The United States did participate in World War I, but relatively late in the timeline of World War I, so was not as large of a factor in the outcome of World War I. Plus, it was not that powerful of an entity at the time of World War I. There was a view of isolationism, which I believe the United States should return to, but something called the Monroe Doctrine is often cited as a reason for that, and the military was very minimal. At Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, which was not a U.S. state in 1941, that had, by many accounts, 40 to 50% of the entire Pacific Fleet of the U.S. stationed there because the Pacific Fleet was so much smaller than it was going to be a few years later. And there was a fear that Japan, if attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor, could easily invade California and invade deeply into the western U.S., get all the way up to the Mississippi River, which in terms of distance is 2/3 of the way to the East Coast. And therefore, being attacked, the United States started to ramp up military production and ramped it up so fast that the Axis powers were surprised at how quickly the industrial base of the United States could ramp up production of war machines like airplanes, ships, tanks, and so forth. And by 1944, it was obvious that the United States would be able to assist the Allies in winning all of World War II simply because of the volume of output that the United States was producing. This was a technological advancement in terms of manufacturing, as well as the sophistication of the planes and warships that the United States was producing. And the atomic bomb was also a byproduct of this technological acceleration. Now, unfortunately, because the United States' military became such a huge portion of the economy during the war economy, as we call it, even in 1945, as World War II ended, the size of the military shrunk somewhat, but it did not shrink to anything close to what it was before December of 1941. It still stayed pretty big, and a lot of generals who were seen as war heroes and became very prominent and powerful people in Washington, D.C., many of whom pursued political careers, wanted to ensure that their importance in society would not go down, and therefore they wanted to make sure there was always a need for a military of a certain size. The Korean War, which of course was to halt the communist spread into all of the Korean peninsula, is in many ways a failure of U.S. diplomacy because China, which was an ally of the United States and the Allied powers just 5 years prior in World War II until 1945, had a Chinese revolution which led to Mao winning the majority of China, the mainland China, and then Chiang Kai-shek, who was more aligned with the West and was not a communist, being relegated to Taiwan. And because communism was spreading in the world, the Soviet Union was already communist during World War II, of course, but China being communist flipped China to the other side, and then the Korean peninsula was something that was a low-hanging fruit to take over. So the Korean War began, and the U.S. military-industrial complex had justification to say, hey, we're always going to have these threats. We are going to have to keep our military big no matter what. Then after that, there was the Vietnam War, which really solidified this military-industrial complex as a business because that was a war that the United States could have won by applying enough force, but there was, in fact, a directive to create a lengthy stalemate. Remember, the Vietnam War was much, much, much longer in duration than the Korean War and even the United States' participation in World War II, simply because a lengthy stalemate enabled the defense contractors and other profiteers who were profiting from the state of war to maximize the amount of money they could make, and that too for a longer period. So the military-industrial complex, which President Eisenhower had warned about when he was president of the United States, 1952 to 1960. And he, of course, was one of the war heroes of World War II, a top general of the United States military in the victorious World War II outcome. He warned about this military-industrial complex, but the Vietnam War solidified it. And after that, while we had relatively few major war operations between 1973 and 1990, unfortunately, too many entrenched people who stood to profit from the military-industrial complex came into power in the United States and invented new wars to make sure that the defense contractors and others profiting from the military, and it's not always monetary profit, it's also career advancement in terms of profit. A war hero is an electable person, or at least was before the modern era in U.S. politics because of the momentum from World War II. The Bush family was a big perpetrator of the military-industrial complex, and there were two presidents from that family over a 20-year period. They were presidents for 12 of those 20 years, 1988 to 2008. John McCain is also a big benefactor of the military-industrial complex. And even in modern politics, you have people like Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley on the Republican side. But on the Democrat side, Joe Biden and a large portion of the Democrat Party have also become beneficiaries of the military-industrial complex. The same people who were opposed to war profiteering by Halliburton and others during the Iraq War, rightfully so, I might add, 2003 through 2011, the military-industrial complex figured out, hey, if we just operate out of the Democratic Party, we will get a situation where Democrats support wars, such as sending money to Ukraine right now, which is what the United States is doing, even though it has no real conceivable interest to the average American person. But Republicans are brainwashed into supporting all wars. When the military-industrial complex operated out of the Republican Party under the presidency of George W. Bush, at least you had Democrats and leftists protesting in the streets against war profiteering in this war. No wars for profit, they said. Rightfully so, I might add. Now that the military-industrial complex has figured out that they can simply operate out of the Democrat Party, now they have much less opposition, because many Democrat voters will simply say, if my party does it, it's right. It was wrong because the other party was doing it. So now they're in favor of a war for profit because it's done through their party, when they were opposed to war for profits done through the other party. But many Republicans, they're brainwashed into thinking, well, politics ends at the water's edge, and they often feel tough by supporting a foreign war that they themselves are not risking, and have been brainwashed into still thinking it's 1979, therefore Russia of today is still the USSR, and China of today is still the China under Mao, and that sort of thing. That's why they want to support Ukraine against Russia, even though Ukraine is not some scrappy democracy. It's a very corrupt kleptocracy that is of no benefit to the U.S. whatsoever, and so forth. So the military-industrial complex has figured out what to operate out of. That is an example of the free market system failing because an industry can use the government to artificially create more demand for itself. The same is true for big pharma. Classify more and more things as diseases that need an expensive pharmaceutical. Many of these things are not really diseases, and many of these pharmaceuticals are just plants that are available in nature. Just a more concentrated version is now a pill that is easy to pop. And yes, it's easier to pop a pill than to create your own turmeric or consume a lot of pistachios or whatever. But that is a form of artificial product created for profit, and many things are designed to increase demand for pharmaceuticals. Whatever you think of COVID-19, the people who made money from the COVID-19 vaccine, which arguably made a lot of people worse off, they had a big financial interest in the continuation of this pandemic and people being frightened enough to take a vaccine that they might not have really needed. Big tobacco, same thing, advertising to children, trying to get more and more people smoking. Other lobbies that are not nearly as vilified, but soft drinks that use high fructose corn syrup. The marketing departments of Coca-Cola and Pepsi have for decades marketed to people to the extent that in the United States, water consumption has gone down while consumption of Coca-Cola and Pepsi has risen. And this is high fructose corn syrup, one of the worst things you can consume. It will cause diabetes, cancer, all of the above. Anyone who consumes that is outright consuming poison, yet the average American probably consumes at least 1 can's worth a day, even though that drink has an extremely huge amount of high fructose corn syrup in it, as much as can be saturated into the watery liquid that the drink comprises of as the solution. Yet big sugar and big corn is not vilified to the same extent that big tobacco was, although it should be. And big tech is yet another such instance. We were led to believe that technology could never become an oligopoly that uses the government to create its own artificial demand, because there would be tech startups that always disrupt other big tech companies. But now many big tech companies acquire startups for the purpose of shutting them down. So these big tech companies are actually anti-technology companies. They have monopolies on their primary product, and then they get political favors from the government by pushing the government's agenda. This is where the fact that the U.S. government is really a uniparty and that we have a deep state becomes very, very evident. There are not two opposition parties. There is just the dominant party, which is the Democratic Party, and then the pretend opposition that exists in order to lose, the Republican Party. If you're familiar with the Harlem Globetrotters, the Republicans are the Washington Generals. If you're familiar with professional wrestling, like from the WWE, the Republican parties are the top of the card heel that is scheduled to lose to the face. Use whatever metaphor you want to use, it's very much the same thing. And big tech can increase the surveillance and shut dissidents or anyone who disagrees with the agenda the government is pushing out of jobs, out of internet access, get them in all sorts of trouble, and so forth. So this is also an example of a big XXXX that has used the government to create monopoly power and also create artificial demand for itself. And that's why technological innovation in many cases slows because of these big tech companies, because they can get the government to back them, to guarantee them, to make them too big to fail, which smaller, innovative tech startups do not have any such protections. And there's an entire list of industries that then profit from pain and therefore create artificial demand by spreading pain onto people. And this is a list of many of them, but it's by no means complete. And one of the functions of government is to not only not assist this process by taking bribes and writing regulation in favor of the biggest companies in any particular sector, but also prevent this process from occurring. It should not be easy to profit by increasing demand of something that causes pain. At least big tobacco was taken down to some extent, but many other such oligopolies that use the government to create artificial demand are not being taken down. We still have a military-industrial complex, for example. We still have big pharma, and we now have big tech, something that could not have been envisioned even as recently as 2008 or so. So the function of government is to regulate these sectors because their demand growth is inseparable from causing pain and misery in many cases. They should exist to mitigate pain and misery that occurs organically, yes, but they should not get to the point where they are increasing demand for their product by then causing further pain. The U.S. prison industry is another example. The U.S. has 4 times as many prisoners per capita than in 1980. Have the American people become 4 times more criminally inclined since 1980? I don't think so. But prisons are a for-profit business, therefore putting more people in prison via a process of classifying more things as crimes and lengthening sentences for crimes is a way of creating artificial demand that unfortunately leads to people being in prison for something that would have been a much lighter sentence or no sentence in 1975, for example. It is not to say be soft on crime, but don't classify everything as crimes. There are certain very well-known, well-established traditional crimes that should stay as crimes, but then classifying all kinds of things as crimes leads to a situation where a huge portion of the U.S. population is in prisons, which causes an erosion of human capital. Even when they're released, they cannot easily integrate back into society. Employers don't wish to hire them, and they are not even accustomed to being free anymore. So you have eradicated the human capital of someone who innately may not have even really been a criminal at all. He might have been in prison for something that would not have been a very serious crime at all in 1975, or may not be a very serious crime in the countries of Western Europe or in Japan or a place like that. So that's enough food for thought on this topic. But if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.